If you've watched my videos before, you've seen me in a nice, tightly composed shot, just like this, that shows you exactly what it is that I want you to see. But the way that my shot is composed isn't the way that the world is, or even the way that my office is. There's a lot that goes into composing my shot and putting everything together so that you see precisely what I want you to see, and so I can have everything just so. Here's a good question. Would it be better to know what it takes to make a video like this, or would it be better to remain ignorant? The ancient Greek philosopher Socrates thought that it would be better to know. It would always be better to know, and his reasons for thinking this tell us a lot about what he thought about intrinsic value and what made wisdom so valuable. A lot of what we know about Socrates, in fact almost everything we know about Socrates, comes from dialogues written by his student Plato, in which Socrates would debate other famous people about the nature of knowledge or truth or justice or wisdom or whatever was on Socrates' mind that day. Now, a lot of these dialogues are obviously fictional. Socrates would stand in, along with these other famous Athenians, as a sort of shorthand for some different positions that contemporary readers would have found instantly recognizable. It'd be sort of like if I was going to write a dialogue about the nature of art and I had characters like Taylor Swift and Kanye West. Even before they say anything, you know exactly where this dialogue might be headed. Now, this isn't true of all of the Socratic dialogues. Some of the Socratic dialogues, especially the ones surrounding Socrates' trial, death, and execution, are thought to be pretty historically accurate. But since I want to spend some time talking about an obviously fictional dialogue, I think it might actually be a little bit helpful to give you some background on who the historical Socrates actually was. Socrates was an Athenian philosopher who lived in the 5th century BCE. According to legend, he spent his life trying to figure out the nature of wisdom in order to disprove a claim that the Oracle of Delphi made about him, that he was the wisest person that ever lived. In 399 BCE, he was convicted of corrupting the youth of Athens, and he was executed. So obviously Plato is not a disinterested source. He's one of Socrates' most important students. But generally speaking, we think that the historical record actually matches up with what's in the Socratic dialogues around Socrates' trial and execution. And if you read these, you come to the realization that Socrates was certainly innocent of the charges that were brought against him. They were basically politically motivated and brought to make this guy who had managed to upset a bunch of really powerful people just sort of go away. Now the question is, what exactly did he do to upset these really powerful people? And the answer has to do with that prophecy from the Oracle at Delphi. So the Oracle at Delphi said that Socrates was the wisest person who had ever lived, and Socrates didn't think that this was true, and so he spent his entire life trying to figure out, why the Oracle would say this about him, because it was supposed to be an infallible religious source. And the answer that he came up with was actually really interesting. He said that if he was the wisest person who had ever lived, it was only because he was the only person who understood the limits of his own knowledge. He didn't try to make claims or go beyond the limits of his own knowledge. And as a result of that, he thought that it meant something very specific about the rulers of Athens. Basically, Socrates thought that the rulers of Athens were bad at their jobs because they were not only ignorant, but they were actually ignorant of their own ignorance. And that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. But we're actually here to talk about the Republic. So let's talk a little bit about that. What exactly is the Republic? So the Republic is basically an extended conversation between a bunch of people at a house party who are discussing the nature of justice. And they're discussing the nature of justice because they think that if they can understand this, they'll be able to understand how the ideal city should be organized. And if you ever have the chance to read the whole Republic, you'll see that Socrates actually comes up with this really fascinating answer where he says, justice isn't actually its own thing. Justice is actually when different virtues are actually in balance with one another. And so the just city is going to be the city where the city virtues are all in balance with one another. And what that means is that the city isn't actually going to actively have to seek out and take care of the needs of its residents. The needs of the residents are just sort of going to be taken care of automatically. So the trick, Socrates thinks, is figuring out who we should put in charge of the city. And you'll remember that Socrates thought the people who were actually in charge of the city of Athens were very, very bad at their jobs. And perhaps not disinterestedly, Socrates thought that the people who should be in charge of the city were actually the philosophers. He thinks that cities should be ruled by philosopher kings. And you might think this is a very self-interested answer, and a lot of people would probably agree with you, but that's not what Socrates would say. Socrates would say that the philosophers should be put in charge of ruling the city because they are disinterested. They're the ones who actually aren't interested in seeking power or glory or fame or conquest or anything like that. They're interested in the pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of wisdom, and like having to actually rule the city will just get in the way of what they actually want to do. So they'll come up with the best, most efficient way to run the city and then just like leave it at that so they can go back to being philosophers or whatever. Throughout the Republic, Socrates uses a lot of metaphors and stories to try to get his point across and make his arguments. And maybe the most famous one of these is something called the allegory of the cave. Now, in the allegory of the cave, people are held captive and forced to look at images that are projected on the wall for their whole lives. And since this is all that the captives know, that's what they think is real. The real world is just what's been projected in front of them, the same way that you might think that my office just is what you're seeing in this very neat, tightly composed frame. But one day, one of the prisoners' chains breaks and they're able to get up and look around, and they see that, the images on the wall aren't actually real. They are projections that have been put there by their captors. And after a while, the prisoner gets up and he's actually able to escape the cave and go out into the sunlight and see the world as it really is. The sun shining on the trees and the lakes and the rivers and the mountains and all of that stuff. And he sees it and he gets so excited. He thinks it's so wonderful that he thinks that he absolutely is obligated. He must return back into the cave and share all of this knowledge and share all of this wisdom with his fellow captors. And what Socrates is saying with this story is basically that, when you get wisdom, you're going to want to, it's going to be so wonderful that you will need to rush back in and share your wisdom with everybody else. And this is supposed to be the nice, neat story of the allegory of the cave, as it's often told in introductory philosophy classes or introductory ethics classes when students encounter it for the first time. Person is freed, person gains wisdom, person can't wait to share it, person returns to share it with everyone else. But, and this is really important, this is not the whole story when it comes to the allegory of the cave. There are some really important and actually maybe really disturbing details that get left out here. For example, when the prisoner leaves, he's really confused and he's really upset when he realizes that the images projected on the wall aren't real. It's very distressing. When he actually leaves the cave and he goes out and he sees the sunlight for the first time, it hurts his eyes. When he decides that he wants to return, he has to go back into a dark cave and he's not used to the darkness anymore, and he stubs his toe and hurts himself and basically just stumbles around in the dark until his eyes adjust. And then, actually probably the worst part of all of this, he goes to tell everybody what he has discovered. He's discovered the truth and he is excited to share it. And he shares it with all of his friends, the other captives, and they are shocked and outraged. They do not believe him. In fact, they are so angry, they are determined to kill him to shut him up. This is really important. You might think that if someone discovers like fundamental truth or secret truth after being like freed from bondage by their captors, the captors might try to kill that person to shut them up. And Socrates thinks, no, that's not the case. That's not what's going to happen. Instead, what's actually going to happen is that the other captives are not going to believe him, and they're going to be so upset at this idea that's being put in front of them that they're actually going to take care of it themselves. They're going to kill the guy who has the truth, and the captors don't actually have to do anything. So this idea that knowledge is dangerous and the pursuit of knowledge and wisdom could actually be, threatening to your own life isn't just something that is contained in the allegory of the cave. It's actually something that you can see throughout the entire Republic because of who the people at this dialogue are. So this dialogue is taking place in the middle of a very famous war, the Second Peloponnesian War. And at the end of this war, Athens loses and is conquered by Sparta. And as a result, a bunch of the people who are at this party, who are generals and diplomats and other important people in Athenian society, end up getting executed for their role in the war. On top of this, Socrates, today the most famous person who's a part of this dialogue, is executed by hemlock poisoning. But here's something you might not know about Socrates and his execution. He was forced to drink his own poison, hemlock, that killed him, but he actually had several chances to escape this fate, both during his trial and afterwards while he was awaiting execution. In the trial itself, when they were trying to figure out what the penalty would be after he was found guilty, there were actually two options. He could have been asked to pay a small fine or be executed. And most people think that if he would have stood up and offered some sort of reasoned defense, or would have, at least pretended to be sorry or something like that, he could have paid the fine and gone about his way. Instead, he stood up and said that neither of these punishments were appropriate, and the thing that would, absolutely punish him the most would be to throw him an enormous party in his honor, because boy, did Socrates hate parties. Socrates did not actually hate parties. So that obviously didn't work. But actually, after he was sentenced to death, most of the people who sentenced him to death probably didn't actually expect him to go through with this. He was very lightly guarded. His friends were able to visit him and come and go and all that. And basically the people in Athens who put him on trial just wanted to be rid of him. They didn't care how. And so his friends came to him and said, we've got a plan to sneak you out of here and, get you home and allow you to live out your life and not be executed. And Socrates refused. He said that he was going to go through with the execution because to do otherwise would basically be intellectually dishonest. It would be a betrayal of everything that he stood for. And everybody would see that he was just a great big hypocrite for, shying away from wisdom and truth and knowledge when it was at its most dangerous. And so against his friends', very obvious strong wishes, he chose to stay and be executed. So this leads to a really interesting question about the nature of wisdom and knowledge and happiness and what's actually valuable. Socrates was literally given a choice a couple times between happiness and wisdom and truth and knowledge. And he picked wisdom and truth and knowledge, not just at the expense of this sort of general commitment to happiness, but actually at the expense of his own life. And that's, a really powerful choice to make. And if that's a choice that someone wants to make, or someone wants to say that wisdom really is that important, you need a really powerful, good argument for why that's the case. Or if you want to say something like, it's good to be happy even if that means being ignorant, again, you're probably going to need a really good, strong argument. But you might ask yourself, is this always going to be the case? Is this actually something that is going to be universally true? Or is it possible that what value we should pursue is actually going to depend on the context we find ourselves in? That's something that I want to look at next time when we look at another ancient Greek philosopher, Aristotle.